I wanted to start just with something that I feel is a great gift for Elul. I found it in a sefer a few years ago, and many people have told me that it has brightened their lives greatly. Elul, you hear a lot of different talks about Ani ledodi v'dodi li. It's this time of love between us and Hashem. HaMelech Basodeh, that image that the king is accessible, is in the field. And many people wonder, why is it then that sometimes in Elul things go the opposite for me? I get angry, I get frustrated because things have gone wrong for me, particularly in Elul. I try to do things and I fail, all these different things. It feels as if Hashem doesn't want your tshuva, like you're getting pushed away. So Rabbi Yisachar Dov Belz said, no, exactly the opposite. He said, when do we usually do Averas? We usually do Averas when we're down, when we're depressed, when we're angry, when we're in pain, when we need distraction, all these things. So the power of tshuva is when you're in a similar situation and you overcome it. So Hashem is sending you those situations in Elul so that you can hold strong in those times, and then you do a full tshuva, right, in that same place. I like that very much. Okay, so here we are in Teitzi, as we mentioned last week. These are Parshas that speak about war, and war is both in the physical sense and the spiritual sense, right? There is the concept even of Sarim Shalmala, of the spiritual force of a nation that's in the battle. Now, the Kotzker, the Shem Mishmuel, is the grandson of the Kotzker. You didn't miss any stories yet. I'm saving them up till you came. Okay, so Shem Mishmuel is the grandson of the Kotzker. And he quoted the Kotzker asking a question. He said that it starts off, Ki Teitzi lemelchama al oivecha. Now, I'm not a diktuk expert, but he says oivecha is plural. I think singular would be like oyivcha, if it was just one enemy. Your multiple enemies. When you go to war against your multiple enemies, unesono Hashem elokecha biyadecha. Hashem will give him, suddenly the enemy is singular, into your hand. Okay, now that's one question. Another question that the Kotzker asked is, we find a big difference between the description of war here and the description of war in Parshas Baloscha. Over here it seems like a very quick process. You go to war against your enemies, and Hashem will give them into your hands, and you will take prisoners. That's it. In Parshas Baloscha it says, when war comes upon you in your land, with enemies attacking you, and you have to blow the trumpets, and you have to daven before Hashem, and then you'll be saved from your enemies. Why? What's the difference? Right? Why these two scenarios? What makes one go one way? What makes the other one go another way? So we'll get back to the answers to those questions, but first the Shem Mishmuel wants to take us on a journey. And the journey goes like this. A person has, according to Chazal, Ramach Evarim, 248 limbs. They divide the body up into 248 pieces. These correspond to 248 mitzvahs aseh, positive commandments. Okay, the 365 mitzvahs lo taseh, negative commandments, correspond to the tendons and sinews that hold us together. Okay, which is an important image. So, a person who is missing a limb, he says, is not able to go to the army. They're patur from the draft, according to the Torah. Okay, reasonable. Now, he says, again quoting, this time quoting his father, that spiritually, a person is not fit to fight if he doesn't have all of his spiritual limbs. Why? Because the true victory of Am Yisrael will be if we elevate ourselves to a status which is like Adam Harishon. Okay, there's the statement in Chazal, Atem Kruyim Adam, which means that you, Am Yisrael, are to take the place, are to step into the shoes, so to speak, of Adam Harishon. When you are like that, so then everything else in the world is afraid of you. That was the way it was really meant to be. Adam Rishon was told, I will put the fear of you on everybody in the world. It says, but if we don't have that, so then we're very vulnerable. So therefore, he says, if we're missing these mitzvahs, we don't have that Tselem Elokim, we aren't that Superman, so to speak, and then it's very difficult. Okay. But he reminds us once again, we've mentioned this before, nobody can keep all the mitzvahs. Sounds like a very naughty concept to mention. Nobody can keep all the Taryag mitzvahs, because you would have to be a man, a woman, a king, a Kohen, a Levi, in order to do all of them. We can't. So how do we therefore have the 248 limbs? Nobody does. Nobody can do even the positive mitzvahs, the 248. We should all be, so to speak, spiritual cripples, right? Amputees, missing different parts. He says, but if Am Yisrael are connected, okay, and if each person doing a mitzvah feels like they're part of a body, so then everybody is doing the mitzvah, right? If my hand puts on tefillin, if my mouth eats matzah, my entire self is fulfilling the mitzvah. So therefore, he says, if Am Yisrael are able to join each other with their kavanah, and that's really what's meant, those people, especially Sfardim, Hasidim, before doing the mitzvah, say l'shem yichud, that finishes off b'shem kol Yisrael, in the name of all Am Yisrael. What does that mean? I've mumbled those words so often and not thought of it. What that means is, as I perform this mitzvah, so I'm doing this so that everybody will be part of it. I'm doing this as a cell in the body, as a limb in the body, but because I'm connecting to everyone, everyone's doing it. It's such an important thing to remember. Okay, so therefore he says, each person's individual mitzvahs now become part of the klal, and therefore we all fill in each other's mitzvahs. What one person does, another person gets. What this one's missing, another one fills in. And with that, if we are connected, and if we are united, so then Am Yisrael is that singular entity, ki Teitzi. You go out singularly to war. Unasana Hashem Elokecha biyadecha. Thank you very much. Am Yisrael always wins with that. Okay? Now, he says you have to realize that you're also not just connecting to all the Jews in your generation. You're connecting to all Jews that ever were. This expands the concept of B'Shem Kol Yisrael. Right? When I do a mitzvah now, I'm supposed to be thinking of all Jews in future generations benefiting and connecting to that mitzvah. I get connected to the way the tzaddik 500 years ago did that mitzvah. That's this concept of Klal Yisrael. It's beyond time and space. So therefore, he says, that enables it to be whole, to be something which is there, and everyone is considered part of everyone it's supposed to be. Okay, I'll just tell a story, even though this is actually the story I've told in the separate story segment, but in case people don't get the chance to look at that, because it illustrates this so beautifully. In this week's parsha, we have the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. So once the Belzer Rebbe, the same Yisachar Dov Belz, came to a town, Ratzford, in Europe, and they built a big tent so all the Hasidim could come, all the people who wanted to be there at the davening, at the tish. And with all those people, you usually have some things that get lost. So one Chassid noticed a gartel on the floor, right? A gartel. And he yelled out, says, anybody lose a gartel? If you provide simonim, I'll return it. Simonim are identifying characteristics. That's the game plan. When you find a lost object, you want to get it to the rightful owner. So therefore, you want the person to identify it. How do you identify a gartel? So if you've been in the gartel market, they have different amounts of threads, they're called, for the width. You know, you can have your little 4-thread gartel, your 20-thread gartel. So the guy yelled out, yeah, I lost my 18-thread gartel. I counted it through. He says, yep, it's yours. And he prepared to throw it across the tent to this person. At this point, the Rebbe walked in, and he saw what was going on. He said, don't throw the gartel. Chassid stopped. He says, you have to think for a minute first. You're about to do a mitzvah, Hashavas Aveda, returning a lost object, that many people may not have the opportunity to do in 120 years of life. Okay, we tend to view it as an everyday type mitzvah, but how many times do you actually find the lost object? And if you do, how many times you actually succeed in getting it back to the actual owner? He says, and before you do that mitzvah, you should think that you're doing it b'shem kol Yisrael, that you want everyone, everywhere, every when, to have a part of your mitzvah. That's the way it's supposed to be done. It's an amazing expansion of that concept of b'shem kol Yisrael. Okay, so therefore he says, we see how important achdus is. We see how important unity is. And we return, he's come across this theme many times. How do we reconcile the fact that a person is unique and is supposed to express their uniqueness, and the many different approaches, legitimate Torah approaches that there are enriching us, with the fact that we're all supposed to be united? Right? How does one do it? What unites us? What unites different people? And here he brings a fascinating idea. He says it's particularly the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu. Okay, let's step back and explain this a second. Parshas Kedoshim begins with this mysterious mitzvah, Kedoshim Tiyu, which translates poorly as you should be holy. What, how, where? So we'll jump straight to the Ramban's Perush, this very famous Perush, which is called Kadesh Atzmecha B'Mutar Loch. You should sanctify, so to speak, dedicate yourself, even with things that are allowed to you. He says this closes a potential loophole in the Torah, which is called Novel Birshus HaTorah. Novel Birshus HaTorah means to live a disgusting life without transgressing anything in the Torah. How? If we go to basic Doraisa law, a man can marry 50 wives, right? He can spend his days eating steak and drinking wine. And he'll say, what do you want? Go into my living room, there are 50 ksuvas on the wall, right? The meat has the finest hashgacha, the wine, right, as well. Let the good times roll. Where does it say that this is forbidden? So he says, Kedoshim Tiyu comes to close up that loophole of where does it say it's forbidden. But there's more than that. Kedusha doesn't just mean torture yourself. Saying, you know what, it's true. The Torah allows you to do lots of things, but you should be holier than that. What does that mean, to be holier than the Torah? What? Why? What does anyone gain from that? Kedusha doesn't mean simply not doing. Kedusha means separating from something in order to dedicate yourself to something. Or it means to do something in a way which is dedicated to a certain purpose and therefore separated by others. The classic example, like Rashi brings in Maseches Kiddushin, when the young man says to the young woman, Hareyat mekudeshes li, so Rashi says that means that she's forbidden to every other man in the world, like when someone dedicates something to the Beis HaMikdash, causing it to become hektish, it's forbidden for anyone to use aside from the Beis HaMikdash. Now, why do we view it as a happy event when somebody's mekudeshes, right? Some girl gets her engagement ring. I'm engaged. What does that mean? It means I'm forbidden to every man in the world, aside from Shlomi, who gave me the ring. Why is that something of joy? Because that connection could not have happened without the separation. It's two sides of the same coin. Okay, so therefore, Kedusha implies dedication, and sometimes doing something in a way which is separated, dedicated, is something very different. Now, why does he say that the concept of unity of Am Yisrael depends on this? Because often we do mitzvahs egotistically. Right? We have to admit it, and it's part of our progress in life. You know, that the olam yikayim adam Torah mitzvahs shelo lishma shemitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. Everyone starts off doing mitzvahs with ulterior motives. And you're supposed to mature and grow into doing it for the sake of the mitzvah itself. But it's there. We worry about, how am I doing in my statistics, my mitzvah earned average versus my avera average, and things like that. And therefore, we're separated. We can be in the same shul, doing the same mitzvahs, but everyone's worried about himself, and everyone's thinking about himself. He says, a true expression of caring about the cause itself is what's called kedoshim to you. When a person is about to face a decision, a choice, and there's nothing in the Torah that says that you can't do it, but you're saying, wait, how is this going to affect the mission of Am Yisrael and my mission of a Jew and what Hashem wants in the world? That expression enables us to connect, because then we're all focused on the same thing. In that, you're not focused on just myself and my performance of the mitzvah. The only thing that motivates a decision when it comes to Divrei Reshus is looking to see that big picture and connecting to it. Okay, let's step back a second for Divrei Reshus. It's an interesting expression which is often mistranslated. Rav Hutner points out, right, translating Divrei Reshus as things of permission, meaning the Torah has mitzvahs that we have to do. The Torah has averas that we're not allowed to do. What do we call something that's not a mitzvah, not an avera? What Chazal called it is Divrei Reshus. So that implies, okay, doesn't say any place I can't, I don't have to do it. The Torah gives me permission to do what I want. That's a terrible translation, he said. In reality, the word Reshus means domain. Okay, like in Hilchos Shabbos. Reshus HaYochid, the domain of the individual. Reshus HaRabim, the domain of the many. Even in modern Hebrew, you have Reshut HaShidur, the Israel Broadcast Authority. They control who and what and how broadcasts. The Israel Antiquities Authority, Reshut HaAtikot. Even the word Reshet, which means a net, relates to it because a net controls that which is inside of it. So therefore he said, Divrei Reshus are like this. He quotes the Chosvos Halvavos, who says that nothing in life is spiritually neutral. There's no action in life which is parav, which makes no difference to the spiritual equilibrium of the world. Everything in the end is going to move the world either toward Kedusha or towards the opposite. You use the phrase at Rav Hutner and say there's no Switzerland in Ruchnias. Right? There's no neutral country which is there. So then what does differentiate between a mitzvah, avera, and a devar reshus? He says a mitzvah is hardwired to bring kedusha and positivity into the world. The avera is hardwired to do the opposite. The action, which is divrei reshus, means you will guide it one way or another. It's in your control. Right? If the Torah, there's no mitzvah in the Torah, thou shalt play tennis. There's no avera in the Torah, thou shalt not play tennis. Two people can play tennis, right? One person is doing it for very positive reasons. His doctor told him, you got to exercise more, you got to do something you enjoy and get the heart pumping. His wife told him, you're too uptight, and I just read an article that said if you exercise, it can lower your stress. So he goes there to be a healthy Ovid Hashem, to be a better husband, a better father, positive. Another person might say, I don't want to be around home too much. My wife keeps asking me to help out, right? I'm going to tell her that I have to play tennis, right? That's a good way to get out. And I'm always going to pick to play against somebody who's not as good as me at tennis so I can humiliate them and make them feel bad. Negative. The same thing. That's divrei reshus. So in that realm, he says, is where a person really expresses dedication to the cause itself. That's your realm. That's where you are making those choices. The Torah hasn't nailed it in for you. You must do this or you must not do that. That's where you're expressing that. And a person who expresses himself in Divrei Reshus is connected to the ideal of Am Yisrael. He's not just looking, okay, what can I do without getting any demerits? Right? Show me where it says I can't do this. He's looking at the big picture. Where's this going to get us? What would Hashem want in this situation? That is what would join us together, right? That connects us to Hashem Avinu Shebashamayim, and then we'll be able to be like one person. That's Ki Teitzi LaMilchama. Interestingly, Rashi says, this is talking about what's called Milchemes Reshus. Again, not just optional war, but it means a war that you control. There's Milchemes Mitzvah, wars that Am Yisrael had to wage, either to conquer Eretz Yisrael or defensive wars. Milchemes Reshus is that in certain circumstances, like David HaMelech did conquering Syria, a nation can decide to go out to be at war. So he translates that, so to speak, as Ki Teitzi LaMilchama means if you are a person who does battle in the realm of Reshus, who doesn't simply do everything just because it's not forbidden, but is a person who's looking, how is this going to affect my overall contribution to Am Yisrael's mission throughout the ages, that's a person who's connected to it. Okay, this is the picture of what and how we should be. All right, let's bring in this story, which I think is good. Right. Also, they say that when Rebbe Elimelech of Lizhensk passed away, so at the first yahrzeit, his Talmud, the Chozeh of Lublin, was looking down. He was looking depressed. Now, the Chozeh had what was called a badchen. Okay, the concept of badchen nowadays, oftentimes people translate it as a comedian or something, somebody who goes to weddings and says jokes. But in reality, the badchanim, especially in the Batei Medrash of the great Rebbe's, had a very important task. First of all, whatever funny things they said always had a deeper meaning. And oftentimes their task was to help the Rebbe sometimes stay grounded to this earth if he was heading off. And so it was that the Chozeh Lublin had a famous badchen. So he saw that the Rebbe looked down. He came over to him, he said, Rebbe, do you want to hear what happened when Rebbe Elimelech came up to Shamayim? After he passed away, he came up to reception in the next world, and they showed him to his room. Would you like to hear what was in the room? He says, please. He said the room had wall-to-wall Sfarim, floor to ceiling, every sefer that the Rebbe could possibly want. And in the middle there was a nice comfy chair and a lovely table, and on the table was a steaming cup of tea, and next to it a little silver box with the finest shmektabik, right, the finest snuff. So do you want to know what Rebbe Elimelech said? He said, what did he say? He looked around the room and he said, all my life I've been telling the Hasidim to be careful not to end up in Gehinnom. And here I am, and it's not so bad. And the Chozeh clapped his hands, he said, Taka, it must have been like that. What's the depth of the story? The Talmud Rebbe explained it like this. He says, Rebbe Elimelech, we think that what motivated him in everything he was doing in life was because, yes, I'm getting up there in the standings of the great heroes of Judaism. My next world is going to be better and better with each thing that I do because I'm such a tzaddik. He went through life assuming could very well be I'm a Russia. Could very well be I'm getting the down elevator in the next world. That isn't what affects me doing or not doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm caring about the klal. If I right now have the ability to do something that moves forward what Am Yisrael is supposed to be doing in the world, I'm doing that and I'm doing it joyfully. I'm not thinking about me in terms of that. There's a beautiful mashal, I saw Rebbe Elimelech Biederman brought it down. Sounds a little strange, but I like it a lot. About some czar or king back in Russia who was paranoid. Okay, not uncommon. He always felt that somebody wanted to assassinate him, and there may have been basis for that. But to him, it reached an extent that when he traveled, he wanted soldiers stationed at regular intervals on every road that he would or even might travel. So one time he was going to go out hunting, and he spoke with the general. He said, this is the area I want to go hunting in. I want you to station soldiers every couple hundred meters, right, on all the roads and pathways that I might take. So there's one Russian soldier standing there, and of course they had to be in full dress uniform, because this was the king who might come by. And he's standing on this road with his rifle. standing, and it was the summer, and it was really hot. And he was schwitzing, and sweat was dripping down his back. And to make things worse, there was a beautiful babbling brook right near where he was standing. And he kept looking at that cold, refreshing water. And he started to think in his mind, maybe I can get away with it. What are the odds that the king's going to come on this road? And what are the odds that he's going to come in those 10, 15 minutes that I kind of take a splash and cool myself off? Eventually, he did it. Put down his gun, took off the uniform, joyfully dived in. As he's splashing around, suddenly he hears a sound. It's hoofbeats. He looks up the road. He sees horses approaching. It's the king, and they're moving fast. Doesn't know what to do. He jumps out of the water, and he grabs his rifle, and he stands at attention. Now, what was missing here was putting his uniform back on. So the king's carriage or horse pulls up, and he stops, and he tells the soldier, you have a few seconds to tell me why I shouldn't kill you. He says, Your Majesty, I know this looks bad, but I saw that you were coming, and the only thing I cared about was that you should be safe. He says, you're now promoted. Right? This is this idea that it's not about the me, it's about the us, it's about the big picture. This is a very important theme on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah frustrates people because they tell us everything you're going to have this year is decided on Rosh Hashanah. If you're going to have this, if this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And we're looking through that very large machzor for the places where we can, so to speak, give our wish list. You know, on this new year, I would like this, that, and other. And it doesn't really appear there. Only a few hints in very general terms for Parnasa, for Refuah, and Avinu Malkeinu, different things like that. The answer is because on Rosh Hashanah, the day of the coronation of the king, you're supposed to be thinking of the big picture. It trains us to be thinking of the big picture, of the mission of Am Yisrael, of the Malchus of Hashem, of all of us and everything. It's never the individual on Rosh Hashanah. It's true, you're looked at as an individual. We do say that, right? That everybody goes before Hashem kivnei maron, but it's always in context of the whole. And the more we prepare ourselves to be part of the whole, the more successful our Rosh Hashanah is. He says a fascinating example of someone who had this power of victory was Yonasan. Yonasan, the son of Shaul, who went to war against the Plishtim, simply him and his weapons carrier. And they defeated an entire Plishti army. He said, how? He says, because Yonasan did a very powerful Devar Reshus. He stepped back from his position as the inheritor of the kingship and decided he would support David. He didn't have to do that. There was nothing specific told to him that he had to do that, but he felt that would be better for Am Yisrael. Someone who is able to do that is connected to all and everyone. And then that person is part of that, so to speak, universal Jew, who when you absorb that inside of yourself and you become connected to that, you have incredible power. The power to the extent that the enemies run away from you. Chazal point this out in other places with the war. The Medrash, Vayikra Rabbah, says that there was so much Torah learning in the time of David HaMelech. They said, Tinokos shahayu bimei David, the children in the days of David, hayu yodin lidrosh esatorah memtes panim Torah, etc. They could darshan the Torah in 49 different ways, this way and that way and this way and that way. The kids were sharp lamdonim. V'yotzim le'ochama v'noflim. They went out to war and they fell. They didn't succeed. Why? There was lashon hara among them. There was jealousy. There was backstabbing. Without the unity, even with all of that spiritual magnitude of the Torah they knew, they don't have that power which is necessary to be victorious. Right? And they point out the opposite, that even in the generation of Achav, who was a terrible idolater, but they had this unity, they had this connection, they were victorious in war. Because you actually become this entity that the enemies can't stand up to, if you are connected to Am Yisrael as they truly are. Now, he says, if the Jewish people don't utilize their potential for achdus, so then other nations take it. Okay, it's left over, it's sitting there, other nations can take it. He says, in essence, there is no overriding thing that unites other nations, like what unites Am Yisrael, but there's a type of faux unity that they can grab if we don't have that unity. He uses this to explain something that always bothered me. When Am Yisrael reached Yam Suf, and they saw V'hinei Mitzrayim nosei achareim, they saw the Egyptians coming after them, and they got very afraid. Why did you get afraid? You just saw Hashem give them 10 makkahs this way and that way and this way and that way, right? And they were yelling and crying and screaming. So they're coming to get more? Sit on a chair and watch it happen. What's going to be? You have Hashem's presence here with the Amud Anon and the Eish and all these things. What are you afraid of? So the answer is, right, they said they saw Sar Shel Mitzrayim, the spiritual force of Mitzrayim against them. And that all came from the singular. V'hinei Mitzrayim nosea, singular, achareim. The Egyptians had unified. And Am Yisrael were afraid that they weren't unified enough to be able to stand up to that. The battle that we really face in the spiritual realm is that idea of the unity. And it's hard. It's hard to feel this connection to people that are different from you, to people that are either more stringent than you, or more makel than you, more knowledgeable than you, or less. There's always some reason. Lubavitcher Rebbe had a beautiful answer to the question. I saw a recording once of Mordechai Elioz Zatzal and Avram Shapiro Zatzal went to visit him once. It was during Sfiras HaOmer. So they discussed the question of how could it be that the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva died because they didn't treat each other with kavod. Rabbi Akiva's famous statement is "V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, ze klal gadol b'Torah." You should love your fellow man like yourself. This is the big klal, the big general rule of the Torah. How could it be? So they offered their answers. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said, I think that it was because each one felt that the other person wasn't as good in Ohev Yisrael, or being Ohev Yisrael in the way that he would want or should want. Even in the world of Avos Yisrael, you can find ways to split up. You're not loving Am Yisrael in the way that you should, right? Unbelievable, but possible. We see it and sense it. Okay, so therefore, he says, this idea of thinking, even before things that we do that are allowed, of everyone and how it will affect everyone and what we're doing, gives us this achdus. So therefore, he says, the difference that the Kotzker asked between Ki Teitzi, in our case, in which the war seems to go zip-zap, is when Am Yisrael are singular, Ki Teitzi. If you've united, that's it. And in fact, the enemies, if they had a form of unity, they'll go from Oivecha, right? And then they'll fall into they'll go and they will lose their unity and you will take its place. The difference between the war here and in Parshas Ba'aloscha, it's plural. Ki tavo milchama ba'artzechem. When war comes upon you, when you are plural, then you got to blow the trumpets. Then you got to daven really hard. Then you don't have that. So he says this all brings us up to Rosh Hashanah, like we said. He says, if on Rosh Hashanah we are meant to somehow join all our pieces together and be there in the form of Adam Harishon, just like on the first day of Adam Harishon's creation, which was Rosh Hashanah, that we are able to stand there and say, we are the Tselem Elokim that is here, ready and waiting to bring the world to its purpose. All the limbs are together. You know the spooky story of the reburial of the Chidah in Eretz Yisrael? Right, this was the Chidah of Chaim Yosef David Azulai. He was from Eretz Yisrael, but he was sent as what was called a Shadar, Shluchah D'Rabbanan, right? That they sent him to raise money. And they used to send the greatest people off in those days to save and to raise money. And he died in Chutz La'aretz. So a few decades ago, the decision was made to rebury him in Eretz Yisrael. It was something that was done with great awe and great trepidation. And Gedolei Yisrael assigned Rav Mordechai Eliyahu to supervise this. So when it came, apparently, especially because I'm a Kohen, I don't know too much about the burial business, but if there is this idea of removing bones and reburying them, you try to organize the bones in order. It's supposed to be if they've separated and such. And here, there was a great fear of even like looking at the bones of the Chidah. And Rav Mordechai Eliyahu prepared himself. And when he put his hands, suddenly there was this sound, and you heard clicks and connections. And then he felt that everything was whole. That everything, all the pieces came together. This is the idea of that which is separate joining together and becoming this whole in this person. Rosh Hashanah is about oneness. Elul is the preparation for oneness. One of the famous Rashi tables for Elul, brought already in Kadmonim, is Ish l're'ehu u'matanos levyonim. The first letters of those words spell out Elul. It comes from the Megillah, describing Shalach Monas. Right? You think it's some Hasidic trick to put Purim into Elul, right? but what it's telling us is the following. You must be approaching Elul in that way. If you do that, your heart opens to the connections. And then that is what connects you to Hashem. Because one of our most powerful tefillahs is Avinu Malkeinu, a nusach from Rabbi Akiva. To stand before the Melech, before the king, is very frightening. Right? A king, a real king, is someone who can say, off with your head, and that happens. But if the king is your father, it's a different ballgame. But in order to be able to say that sincerely, Avinu Malkeinu, it has to be that you look at other Jews as your brother and sister. It's an extension of the same relationship. If that one's not true, that one's not true. So therefore, that's the preparation. We'll finish with a final story. I saw this story about Rabbi Kiva Eger. Rabbi Kiva Eger, one of the greatest of the Acharonim. Right? We have his Sfarim, his Shalos and Shuvas. And he was the Rav of a city called Posen. So one night in the winter, he was up late at night learning Torah with his son, Reb Shlomo. And there was a knock on the door. They opened the door, and there are two women, one older, one younger, looking very cold. So they invited them in, they gave them a cup of tea, and they said, what brings you here this time of night? So the older woman said, my son, who's this woman's husband, she's my daughter-in-law, owed money to the Paritz. Okay? In all these stories, the Paritz is the feudal landowner, the bad guy, and they were often very bad guys, because they would tax the Jews who did anything on their lands mercilessly. And when the debt racked up and the Jew couldn't pay it, oftentimes the penalty was death. And so it was here. She said, he demanded a huge amount of money from my husband. He couldn't come up with it. He's in jail. The Paritz said if he doesn't have it by a certain date, he will be executed. That date is tomorrow. So Akiva Eger asked, how much are you missing? She told him it was a big sum. He had no idea where he was going to get that money. In that time frame, he told his son, put on your coat. They put on their coats and they walked out into the snow. They walked and walked to the edges of the city. Just then, like in nowadays as well, there were sketchier areas of every city. And where the bars and gambling clubs were on the edge of Posen. And there was one particularly, which was the Jewish one. That's where the Jewish gamblers would go and hang out and drink beer and schnapps and vodka, whatever was available then. So we heard the raucous noise. He opens the door and walks in. I've seen paintings of Rabbi Akiva Eger, a very imposing looking figure. And of course, everything goes silent. Somebody asked pretty respectfully, what can we do for you, Rabbi? He said, I would like to speak to you about something. They said, okay. He told them the story of this man who was about to be executed, about the money that was needed. Suddenly the people jumped up. They gathered all the money that was on the tables, and they put it in front of him, and they started counting. And when they finished the count, it came down to the penny or kopek or ruble, whatever it was then, exactly to the sum that was needed. Exactly. Everyone gasped, they felt that they were part of something supernatural here. And they were pretty pleased with themselves. And Rabbi Akiva Eger said, could I speak to you again? They said, certainly, Rabbi. They figure here's the thank you speech. He said, what are you doing with yourselves? Did you ever look at your lives? You come here getting drunk, gambling away money. You're wasting your lives. You got to change. What are you doing? And people looked at him, and one person finally said what the others were thinking. They said, you didn't talk that way before you got the money, right? What was this? He says, I hear your question. You probably think that I never think about you. I sit in the other part of Posen in my yeshiva. I sit in the Beis Din. He says, I think about you all the time. So you'll ask, why haven't I come here before to talk to you? Because you know and I know that you wouldn't have listened to anything I would say. But tonight, you did something very special. You did a very important mitzvah, and you did it with mesiras nefesh, with self-sacrifice. Money is something that's very precious to a person. And you gave it happily. And I said, now their hearts are open. Now they're connected. Now's my chance to speak to them. And they said that many people's lives changed that night. That's ish l'reu matanos levyonim. When we talk, you see, everybody emphasizes the idea of tzedakah and chesed now, not just because I want to gain more brownie points before my court case. I want to become who I'm supposed to become before my court case. I want to connect to who I'm supposed to connect before my court case. That's why it's ish l'reu matanos levyonim. May Hashem help us to be able to connect the way we should fully and to be victorious in all. Have a wonderful week.